Truckload demand. This is a pickup of the conversation from last week where June numbers were in. Today, we're going to talk about the truckload demand and what those numbers mean and what it means going forward. Hey, my friends, welcome back to the Logistics Life. Dean, another good one today, brother. I'm interested in hearing about this truckload demand. You know, last week we talked, we had imports up huge, but yet rates were still dropping. There was all these kind of anomalies in the market. And the truckload demand, I think, is going to put a few of these anomalies to rest. I'm hoping anyways, because some of the stuff that we shared last week, if you're looking at it just on this surface, it doesn't make sense, right? How could imports be that far up to 2.4 million TEU, but yet rates still down 2% and flatbed down 6%? And how does all of this connect? So we're hoping the master of data over here can help us with some of that, Dean.
Yeah, good morning. Good to be with you again.
Yes, sir.
This is a strange market, Dan, and I think there's lots of mixed signals going on. But the one data point that I watch the most closely is Jason Miller's Professor Jason Miller from Michigan State University. He's the expert when it comes to supply chain logistics. Just a level set for everybody. He built out of frustration in the start of the pandemic, an index to explain truckload demand based on publicly available data. And he did that because some of the other indices out there were grossly misleading at the time. And there wasn't really one index that you could say that represents truckload demand, because indices like CAS shipments include some LTL and intermodal in with truckload. ATA truckload tonnage index is contract freight, not spot. It's just primarily contract. FreightWaves OTVI is, contract data, but not a huge sample. If you remember when FreightWaves came out in just after the pandemic, I think it was July, they said volumes were up 56% year over year. And a lot of us said that doesn't make sense. The pandemic has just crashed global demand. How can truckload volumes be up 50%, 60% year over year, whatever the number was, but it was in that order of magnitude. So Jason built an index based on 41 freight generating commodities, right, based on publicly available data. And it includes things like chemicals, manufacturing, food, paper, machinery, steel, right, things that we put on the back of trucks.
And things that we use every day, things that are in constant demand, things that are constantly moving would make sense, right?
And if you put up the chart that I've got there now, that you'll see, and I built today's chart going way back to the start of 2006. I think it was 2006, 2007. And what it shows is the Great Recession in 2008. You can see it on the chart, 2008-9, sorry. The index dropped, so it's an index, right? He's indexed it way back to the turn of the century. But it's a really good data point to put into perspective where things are now. So during the Great Recession, the index dropped to 81. Today, the index is at 102.74. During the bottom of the pandemic, it was 85, right? So if you see on the chart there, you can see the Great Recession on the left at 09. You can see the April 2020 drop in truckload demand. And then on the right, you can see we're up here. Volumes are up about 0.4% in May, and they're kind of up about 2% year over year. But if you look at the line that goes across there, if you draw a line right across to the last quarter of 2018, last month's volumes are identical to where we were in the last quarter of 2018, which was a very good year for trucking. We were on the downslide, though, in the Q4, right? Remember, we had a very busy bull market in the first half, driven by changes in depreciation law, tax law, an oil rally. We also had rebuilding effort from the two Cat 5 hurricanes in 2017. It was a really strong industrial economy, and flatbed did the best out of that market. But if you remember what happened in Q3 of 2018, also, we had a record number of truck buys, truck orders, trucks and trailers. So if you think where does the freight market right now in terms of truckload demand, it's pretty much where it was in Q4 of 2018, but we've probably got 30% more trucks on the road than we did then.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why you've seen downward prices. You asked me last week about why are we seeing, why are, if capacity's exited, why aren't rates going up? Well, the reality is there's still a lot of capacity in the market. So to put
Yes.
some numbers around this, Dan, the ton mile index shows that we're still traveling along the bottom of a trough. When you look at that chart there, you can see that we're kind of bouncing along. The trough has kind of been there for, you could say, for almost a year. There's been a few up and down movements over the course of the time, but truckload demand is right where we were in that last quarter, and there isn't much sign of volume recovering this year. Metallic manufacturing accounts for non-metallic mineral products account for about 5% of truckload demand. It's the third largest manufacturing sector contributing to truckload demand. That sector's given up all of its post-COVID gains, and that's consistent with things like slower construction activity and a decline in oil drilling that we've reported on in recent weeks.
Mm-hmm.
So what you're seeing, Dan, is a fairly flat market, but it's very close to where we were in 2018. So that's just truckload demand. If you look at another indice, which is the Cass Shipments Index that came out, now Cass is a freight payment system. It processes the payments for shippers. I think it's in the order of 30 some odd billion dollars in freight spend. Cass shipments came in, it was down 2% in June, but down about 6% year over year. Tim DeNoyer that writes that, his comment was it fell 1.8% month over month to a 4-year low. He said if there's a silver lining in anything, this is starting to look like a real bottom in the freight market. And he's a good economist. He attributed it to slowing economic growth. Goods demand is still broadly flattish. And we talked about this last week. They see the insourcing of freight via private fleet capacity additions as the main driver of year-over-year declines in for-hire truckload volume. So if you've got to say to yourself, okay, where did most of the carriers join the market during the pandemic? For-hire truckload.
Yeah.
Right. So that's where the capacity excuse me. Sorry, I have to edit that out. I dropped the can. That's where you're seeing the excess capacity is the long-haul truckload sector. Right? Not short-haul truckload, not necessarily specialized. I can put some numbers around it. Across all trucking segments, if you look at the Fred database from the St. Louis Fed, those data are publicly available. The Producer Price Index, which is the value of goods that producers get for their services, trucking rates are down 1% in June. If you look at general freight local, they're up 4.6% year over year. So local carriers are doing well. They're up almost 5% year over year. These are rates, right? So if you look at general freight long distance truckload, so if short haul local is up 5%, long haul truckload is down 4% year over year. If you look at general freight long haul LTL, right? So this is long distance LTL, up 4.6% year over year. If you look at local carriers, specialized local, so these would be specialized local carriers, machinery haulers, those sorts of things, they're up 5% year over year. Whereas specialized long distance carriers are down 4% year over year. So you can see a real split in rates around distance hauled. So the people that are doing short haul, regional, specialized, truckload, LTL are doing exceptionally well. It's the long distance sector that's really struggling right now. And that's what the rates are showing, is that when you get into the longer distance, that's where the rates are struggling, because I think that's where the excess capacity is. Because to come back into
it's where everybody wants.
Right,
And
that's what
sorry to interrupt you, Dean, but it's in working with a lot of carriers,
Yep.
It's my guys want miles, my guys want miles, my guys want miles, and
But
I often have the conversation
right.
of guys, I understand. Like, I mean, it's been like this since I can ever remember, anyways, where it's
Right.
like, no, guys want, the runs to Texas, they want the runs to Arizona, and I'm talking specifically from like
Right.
Ontario, Canada,
Right.
not Ontario, California, yeah, like we talked about last
Yep.
week. Um,
Yep.
but it's like they want these big miles, and they want like one really big mile and maybe one short mile trip a week to make
Right.
their miles for the month.
Yep.
And I often have the conversation saying, well, what makes you think that's the best route? And
Yep.
it's funny because 99% of them come back and saying, well, the more miles, the more money. And I go, no, not necessarily. And again, I've shared this story many times. There during 18, 19, well, in 19, company I worked with, they were like, we're losing money on these runs. And I said, well,
Right.
broker it out.
Right.
Go pick up the freight. You're getting great money head haul. Your
Right.
back hauls are not giving you good money because you're going to the spot market. It's sporadic. It's not like you're delivering there 3 times a week so you can organize a customer bringing you back 3 times a week. Like your team's scattered as to where they're using their focus to sell.
Right.
And they started making like 42% more profit by brokering it out because they would use somebody that had a connection down there to get them home. And they don't have to worry about it. So it's like you
Wow.
make all this money on one part of your triangle, for example, and on the second or third part, you lose your arm and leg, which makes it
Right.
overall not profitable.
Right.
And I'll be full transparency, Dean, that's probably the hardest concept to get people to see.
It's
And
interesting.
it is because I would think, and it's more the mentality, right? Like miles, miles, miles. And
Yep.
and
Yep.
part of me says, you look at some of these local specialized companies out there that changed their model when the after the pandemic and things started dropping. They're home every second night or home every night. They're home on weekends and they're making great money.
Right.
You look
Right.
at Rico, for example. Rico's a
Yep.
perfect example. We've had Rico on the show. You've had Rico on the IQ show many times. His whole philosophy and the way he runs his business
Yeah.
is ideal for these local specialized companies, right? Like,
Right.
I mean, you
Right.
think about it. He's running, he's working hard, but yet he's waiting to get loaded. He's sitting on podcasts. He's
Yeah.
he's having a good time, and he says, "Dan, my home life is awesome.
Yeah.
I love what I'm doing right now. Why would I change it?" And
Yeah.
and I think that's you got decades of this mentality of long hauls, team drivers to California, run them constantly. You're going to make it, and sure, some of them are, but
Right.
some of them are losing their shirts.
Yeah. Well, Dan, that's where you're the most exposed to price volatility, any sort of delay because of weather, and cost of diesel. Right. So it's because
Hmm.
that's your biggest cost. It's going to be a third of your operating costs is fuel. So you're very much impacted by any fluctuation in diesel prices across the country, notwithstanding the fact that when you fuel from one side of the country to the other, you'll start off at maybe $5 a gallon in California, and you might be paying $4.25 in Pennsylvania. Then you back
Hmm.
up to a little bit more. So, yeah, that's a part of the sector that I think is really struggling. You've also got higher wear and tear. Uh,
Yep.
Breakdowns are absolutely, gut wrenching when they happen because you're going to lose not just the time it takes to get the truck, but you're out of sequence.
Yeah.
It'll take a few weeks to get back in sequence on your regular cadence of where you are at each point in the week. So, but I think
Yeah.
your point's valid about, you know, going back to our PPI numbers that show that people are doing fairly well on the short haul side of the business. That's where I think the freight has migrated to. Like, think about a topic we've discussed a lot. A lot more warehouses have been built closer to urban populations. So
Yeah.
that's a lot more construction, a lot more machinery's getting moved, a lot more cranes, a lot more plaster, plywood, steel, all those sorts of things are moving locally and regionally. It's also where most of the freight gets moved, right? So if you think about,
Hmm.
I think 75% of your freight gets moved under 100 miles, like typically across the course of a year. So it's where most freight gets moved. The smallest percentage of freight is really over 1,000 miles, but
Yeah.
it's where people tend to think about it. It's where DAT's sweet spot is sort of anything over 250 miles. You start to get into an area where you don't round trip, doesn't become part of the equation,
Yeah.
unless you're running from, say, Ottawa to Boston and back, or Nova Scotia to Boston and back with seafood. You've almost got to price in the backhaul because you're probably not
Yeah.
going to
Or
get.
like Southern Ontario to Northern Ontario where there's nothing
Right.
coming back, right?
Right.
Like, and especially when it comes to like a lot of
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
construction materials, the
Yeah.
85,000 pounds, you know,
Yeah.
that kind of stuff, you're
So,
always quoting round trip.
so one of the things I saw last week, I saw a real surge in truckload volume out of Pittsburgh to Sudbury. Sudbury's our Northern Ontario market. What's
Yep.
in Sudbury? I've never been there.
So coming from Pittsburgh, I would think that would probably, I mean, I'd have to look, but off the top of my head, it might be steel because Sudbury is actually a huge boom right now to get people to move there.
Is it really?
Oh, it's still very cheap property.
Right.
Sudbury's becoming, the way I see it, anyways, or what my own personal opinion is, Sudbury, I think, is going to become that connection
Right.
between like Southern Ontario, Quebec, the Maritimes, and up into like Saskatchewan, Winnipeg. And the reason being is because most companies go up and over as opposed to going through the US and around the Great Lakes. They go up and over, right? And so that Sudbury connection is like that hub before you get into the, so this is probably won't make sense for a lot of people, but before you get into the real um, country out of the way places, and some people listening to this might say, Dan, Sudbury's way out of the way. But when you think about it, I can get to Sudbury in a couple hours from my house. Like, we go up snowmobiling in Sudbury all the time. And it's like
Oh,
you can go up there in the morning, snowmobile, and come back at night. Whereas anything past Sudbury is quite a trip. It's almost like a week trip instead of a day trip, right? I mean, you'd have to be really aggressive to go up and back in a day, but you can do it after you ride. So
right.
it's but I see tons of ads on TV in Canada for Sudbury. Like, come to Sudbury, the economic engine, and like you start getting manufacturing facilities up there,
Right.
everything up there becomes cheaper, right? Because right now
Yeah.
most of the stuff is brought in from Southern Ontario. So you don't have the,
Right.
you know, $2,000-3,000 orders going up and down, right?
Right.
And
Right.
so you get some manufacturing in there and you get some of that development in there. It'll change that dynamic huge,
Right.
huge.
So Dan, it's 400 kilometers
Hmm.
from Toronto to Sudbury. So
Yep.
does the Trans Canada Highway go through Sudbury?
Yes.
So that's what you were talking about. So it's kind of
Hmm.
it's potentially a staging point because then you could
Yeah.
use. So are you sort of saying that people would use that as a distribution point for?
I believe so. I believe that's what's coming. I do, because
Interesting.
if you think about it, right? If you think about it,
Yeah.
if your distribution center is, say, in the GTA,
Yep.
right? So you're going to have, depending on traffic going up the 400 series highway, depending on, you know, depending on how all of that happens, okay?
Right.
You are actually going to be coming through Sudbury, whether it be on the outskirts, staying on the outskirts, or going through the main portion.
Yep.
And if you create an interchange, you got to think of the time gap that you're going to close to get product into that, you know, early Western central market in Canada. Not
Yep.
only that, you stage it, you have an entirely new section of companies
Yes.
that can
Yes.
now distribute to Western Canada faster than a company dealing in the GTA, right?
So
I think it's a wicked connection spot for a lot of
so
people.
if it's 400 k's each way, you could easily do that in a 12-hour shift with unload and
Mhm.
reload. Like if yeah,
Yeah.
as long as you don't have too many
Especially
drops.
drop and swap. I mean, a lot of carriers do it. So if you look
Yeah.
at companies like Gardewine North,
Yeah.
they've got a facility in Mississauga,
Yeah.
and they literally do line hauls up to their Sudbury terminal.
Right.
From Sudbury, it goes across to Western Canada. So it's just
Got it.
line haul back and forth, trailer come up, trailer go down. All the Western freight comes into the Sudbury terminal, gets transloaded in the Sudbury terminal. I mean, when my son was in Quassa hockey for his high school, and it was up in Thunder Bay, just
Yep.
northwest of Thunder Bay. So we actually trucked all of their hockey equipment because it wouldn't fit in the buses they had.
Right.
They were
Right.
using school buses to get up there. So we trucked all of their equipment to the Sudbury terminal. And
Right.
what they did is, instead of spending, 5-6 hours in a school bus with stacks of high school boys hockey equipment, which probably smelled, awesome.
Awful.
They picked it up in Sudbury. So all we did was bring it all to the dock I was working at. We shrink
Yeah.
wrapped it, put skids
Right.
on the truck. The truck drove it up there. Now they only had an hour of it in the actual bus instead of 6 hours. You know what I mean? So it was like
Wow.
and again, it cost nothing to get it up there.
That's
Nothing.
interesting. So,
Yeah.
Dan, when I look at our volume of loads moved, right, on flatbed loads from Pittsburgh to Sudbury, right, if I look at it over time, it has in the last year, so rates have gone from $3.04 to $3.38 per mile, excluding fuel. So they're $3.38. Peak of the pandemic, they were $4 a mile, but the volume of loads moving has doubled in the last year out of Pittsburgh. So you could draw the inference there that it could be steel related. That kind of volume of flatbed loads, you're probably 100% right, which supports that building activity that's going on up there for all of
Yep.
those sort of economic, reasons. It's interesting. I've seen cities like this become, I don't know, would it be is that a commuter distance? Do they run line runs on motor coaches yet to bring commuters in to say the outside of Toronto, or is it too far still?
A little too far still. That's more the Aurelia area and more
Yeah.
people going up there.
Yep.
I mean, I'm sure, I'm sure Greyhound has service. For sure they do, right? I
Yeah.
mean, you can get anywhere in Canada on Greyhound and stuff.
Dan,
But not too sure about that.
I saw it happen in New York City in the early 2000s when people couldn't buy land in New York City, or even in Philly, PA area, or in commute into New York City. People were doing line runs. Big motor coach companies were doing line runs, overnight line runs, leaving every hour from way out in deep Pennsylvania, running 3-4 hours into New York City every day.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I was doing risk management for an insurance company at the time, and there was some multiple fatalities, like multi-million-dollar claims, ejections, paraplegics, all sorts of horrible damage. And the motor coach company had underwritten it as a local bus company. And I started to look at it and say, well, heck, he's like a long way from home and it's 3 a.m. I pretty much know what's happened. Driver's fallen asleep. But the business had changed because commuters had changed. The commuting distance had become longer because the price of properties had gone through the roof and people couldn't find the affordability. So that's what's happening around Toronto. And I guess people are trying to get away from that 400 traffic, although the 400 goes to Sudbury too, right? If I'm right.
Yeah, so I mean, it goes 411.
Yeah.
You can
Yep.
go up either way.
Yeah.
The 400 extension is now in
Yep.
play, and then after kind of that Barrie, Wasaga Beach area,
Yep.
it tends to tighten up. Like it's no longer 4 or 5 lanes each way; it's like 3
Yep.
lanes. I mean, the extension's really good,
Yeah.
and it's pretty much the only vein to get up there,
Gee, Dan,
right?
like when
Like,
I look at it on a map, you're exactly right. Like it's almost as close from Toronto to Ottawa as it is from Sudbury to Ottawa.
yeah,
And then you've
yeah,
got a straight shot across to Montreal and Quebec City and the
mm,
Maritimes. So
yeah,
Sudbury
yeah.
actually
I
makes
mean, it's a very strategic point.
if ever there was a definition of geographic anality, this
That
would
would
be
be
it.
Sudbury.
Sudbury.